So, queer theory. That's why I clicked on this video. I want to make this video because when I was doing research for a paper on queer theory, I found 0 videos that fit my expectations for what I wanted to see out of it being explained and was engaging in the way I like videos to be engaging. If you know of some of those kind of videos, let me know. I would love to see them. Everyone I've seen is like about fearing God, and I don't want to engage with that. Anyway, I wanted to first position and introduce myself. So you can call me Elle and identify as a lesbian and as genderqueer. They, them pronouns are great. She, her, I accept them, he, him. Not for me, but I won't be that mad at you. I'm from Canada, which informs which communities I'm engaged with, especially queer communities in which queer history has influenced my life specifically. Through this video, I'm going to use a few terms to talk about people. Just wanted to briefly discuss them here. So I use LGBT. I'm sure everyone who's clicked on this video probably knows this acronym: lesbian, gay, bi, trans. I also use LGBTQ+, so all above plus queer and additional. Where I come from is going to influence my specific understanding of queer theory and which queer theories and histories I mention in this video, so keep that in mind. Yeah, I also want to acknowledge that I live here on Turtle Island, and that's why I'm making this video. So the emergence of queer theory is intimately related with social and political activism, specifically things like the gay liberation movement, and also explorations of what homosexual behavior is. Again, I'm using homosexual very specifically because that's where the earliest scholarship starts. Earliest scholarship, commonly known as homosexual studies, gives the background of theoretical knowledges and the understanding of identity that is used in queer theory. This production and collection of queer identities, ideas, knowledges, they form this messy genealogy and these messy lines that eventually converge and lead into queer theory. These genealogies are messy, as already stated. There's incomplete and uncomfortable transitions, and there's always contentious debate in queer theory. If you look for queer theory, you shall find discourse. Because of this, it's very difficult to talk about a hegemonic theoretical position that queer theory specifically takes. So now that I've given a teeny outline, and I've also outlined my biases, which everyone has, don't let them tell you otherwise. Biases are a part of the human experience. Let's get into it. First, we'll start with what is queer. I'm not really going to give a definition, but I'll give a loose outline. Queer is often defined as that which is strange, that which is not normal. It is considered the radical questioning of social and cultural norms, and it is also used as an umbrella term for the LGBTQ+ additional community in very specific situations and necessary situations, especially when it comes to political oppression. According to Miller, 2002, being queer is not the same as being gay. It is a specific way to be and act as a gay person. It is to be an agent of social change, a way of living the radical and the sexual, according to Lorenz, 1991. And most importantly, queer is a self-described identity. It is something that you attribute to yourself. Queer is a fluid identity that can change with differing social circumstances and with your own personal self-perceptions. This form of self-identity rejects expert knowledges of queer bodies and queer identities, deconstructing them and allowing for diverse social identities that are more encompassing of the queer experience. For myself, being queer is something very different in my social identity than being a lesbian or even my gender identity. It in a way informs how I interact with the world, relationships, scholarship, etc., anything I engage with really. Most importantly, there's no strict definition of what is queer. There is an idea of what is queer, and who is not queer, but there's no strict definition that can be really laid out in clear terms, and that's kind of the point of it. Now that we know what queer is, what is queer theory? Well, first we have to distinguish theory. What is theory? So theory is theoretical frameworks we use to apply to vast social situations. One that comes up later on is biopower. So biopower is a theory that understands how the state has power over people, specifically the power to choose who can live and who must die. So this is a widely applicable, very abstract framework that can be applied to many situations where identity, or like in the case of queer studies, history is more specific and it can't be widely applicable to different situations in the same way theories can. As Sullivan 2003 puts it, queer theory is a discipline that refuses to be disciplined. So let's begin our very brief, keyword brief, bullet point history lesson. Early history, where it all began, or actually not where it began at all, just where I'm choosing to begin, because homosexual studies and explorations of homosexual behavior exist everywhere there is homosexual people and where anyone thought to think about how people interact with the world. So that's happened lots. But where we start is in the 1870s with a German homosexual lawyer, Karl Ulrich, who makes the argument that homosexuality is an inherent part of a person and part of their soul. So his argument is that certain men are born with feminine traits, which explains their sexual urges. This, of course, equates homosexuality as a biological reality, which has many implications. Ulrich had many problematic parts of his theory. He didn't really leave room for gay men to be anything other than feminine. In my opinion, I think liking other men is a very masculine thing to do, probably. It's very centered around men, that's all I'm gonna say. He also gives women absolutely zero sexual agency in his theory. Elias's theories of sexual identity are more on cultural construction and how experiences shape how people experience sexual attraction. This is definitely still prevalent in the world today. As a lesbian, I cannot tell you the amount of times a man has come up to me and been like, or even women, anyone has come up to me and they're like, so, what bad experience with a man made you a lesbian? I'll answer that question now for anyone wondering. None of them. Leave me alone, please. Obviously, a very annoying thing to come across in your daily life as a queer person. We also see Westphal, who uses this idea of biological homosexuality as a means in his argument that it is something that can be medically cured, which I'm sure we unfortunately see where this is going. Conversion therapy, which has had a horrible effect on many queer people. So now that I've laid out a little tiny bit of early history, let's look at the 60s, one of the big eras that start homosexuality studies. That's what the era is called by some people, so that's what I shall call it. So let's look at a quick snapshot of political actions at the time in the 60s. So in Canada specifically, the Cold War leads to an event now called the Lavender Scare. According to the Canadian Encyclopedia, this is when RCMP was employed to investigate mostly federal employees and Canadian Armed Force members into their sexual and gender identities because they were thought to be more easily blackmailed by Russia for those identities or be communist or communist sympathizers, and they were forced to either quit, resign, or were demoted. The 60s also mark a very important event in gay liberation in New York in 1969. On June 28th, a police raid on Stonewall Inn leads to protests, riots, rebellion against police harassment of LGBTQ people in LGBTQ spaces. This is a pivotal moment of resistance. It's not the only type of protest of its time. far be it from it, but it is the spark and a very inciting incident that we still use as a moment of political activism and as celebration as pride. Specifically, I want to acknowledge Marsha P. Johnson, a Black trans woman who did a lot for the queer community, specifically at Stonewall. So scholarship in the 60s, we start to see the formalization of homosexual studies with an increasingly politically charged LGBT community with growing calls for equality, equal rights, equal access, equal treatment. This required rethinking the distribution of power and understandings of personhood. So homosexuality begins in urban sociology, historical investigations of homosexuality, as previously mentioned, and also in risk-taking ethnographers. What is an ethnography? So ethnography is a certain type of data collection, usually done through participant observation or interviews. It can be short-term, it can also be very long-term. There is an understanding of homosexuality as related to power structures and culture and also society. Homosexuality doesn't exist within a bubble, it is informed by the world it exists within. And because of this involvement and how things interconnect and relate to each other, power systems and how they interact with identity and control of bodies becomes increasingly relevant. The system in place is now starting to be understood as working exactly as it intended to. It's not failing, this is what it was supposed to do. So Foucault specifically has two key arguments in his History of Sexuality. The 3 volumes, technically 4, but one was published after his death. So he talks about how there is not an innate sexual identity that needs to be liberated out of every person. Definitely into this idea, his other main idea, of constructed knowledges. So how does he talk about constructed knowledges? He frames it in biopower, which we had previously mentioned. It's back. So biopower is used, according to Foucault, by the state to enact control over bodies and identity, and attributing using scientific facts that are created by a specific group of people what is normal and what are acceptable ways of being and identities. Goffman does a lot of work on gender, specifically gender as a performance that contributes to making and breaking social norms. Esther Noonan looks at how gender is a performance that benefits a specific group of people, especially elite people who are most of the people who do knowledge destruction. A specific quote from her, so forgive me if I don't make eye contact, is, "I know now rather than think that the structure of sex roles is maintained by the acquisition of all participants who accept their fate as natural and legitimate." Acquisition, I hope that's how you say it. It's much easier to write than say. There is a focus on identity and cultural norm construction. All right, time to move on to the 80s, or gay and lesbian. The 80s mark the AIDS and HIV crisis, which are both devastating and loss of life, and a horrible weaponization of AIDS to further create fear and unacceptance of queer people. Here we see an increased community solidarity. Police raids also kept happening in the 80s. They didn't stop. In Canada, we have Operation Soap, where over 300 men were arrested, leading to a march of around 3,000 people, and eventually led into Toronto Pride 1981. So, scholarship in the 80s is marked by many key, very important scholars. This is where queer studies and queer theory begin to actually diverge meaningfully. There's an increased focus on self-identity, performativity, and intersectionality. Two very important figures we're going to discuss, so Judith Butler and Eva Sedgwick, who constantly engage with and critique each other's work, which creates a lot of discourse, which queer theory mostly emerges out of. Sedgwick specifically shifts from epistemology to phenomenology. So epistemology is the theory of knowledge, most generally how do you know what you know, while phenomenology is more focused on constructive knowledges that are largely influenced by a person's life experiences. Butler does a lot of work on gender identity. Gender is something that must be constantly re-performed. There are lots of other key scholars in the 80s. Teresa de Loretz, who I mentioned previously, is credited as the first scholar to use queer in an academic setting at the University of California Conference about Gay and Lesbian Studies in 1990. Rubin looks at the hierarchy of good and bad sexuality and how they're weighed against each other. So I told you I'd get back to heteronormativity. Now's a moment, I promised. So, as coined by Warner, heteronormativity is that which normalizes heterosexual as normal and natural and legitimizes it as normal and natural. Cohen focuses on intersectionality, proposing a theory of shared marginality that centers on the idea that a racist and homophobic society has the power to label as deviant those with less economic power. Moving into the 2000s, we finally have our era of queer. How exciting! Yay! Increasingly, we see people in political activism centered around the legal system and power structures. This includes violent police action, also an increased push for securing legal protection and legal rights for queer people. For example, the inclusion of legalized same-sex marriage. In Canada, this is Bill C-38, which was put into place in 2005. Also, an increased focus on trans rights and increased attention to intersectionality. I've just realized I haven't explained intersectionality. My bad. So what is intersectionality? Intersectionality looks at all the privileges, the aspects of your life that account for privileges and how those intersect with one another. So as a white person, I am privileged. As someone who has a deviant sexual identity, I don't have privilege in that aspect. As someone who is straight passing in most situations, I have a very specific privilege. Your economic status is something that weighs into this. So these aren't traits that exist within a vacuum. Sorry, another really important one is racialized identity, but they all interact with each other. Like, I experience very different privilege than someone who is also a lesbian and a gender queer person but is Black, right? This is intersectionality. Here we start to see a queer divide. Here we start to see a clear divide between queer theory and queer activism. And notably, they become separate entities with separate goals. Calling them entities makes me think queer theory is going to come alive and come talk to me. I don't know what queer theory would have to say to me, but I think it's interesting. With the rise of focused political action on very specific legal concerns, there is a concern that radical queer thought and action are being diminished. An example that Lascella 2007 goes very deeply into in their paper is marriage. So marriage is a system that privileges and legitimizes certain kinds of relationships while stigmatizing that which is not accepted within the marriage system. So as same-sex marriage gets accepted, it becomes legitimized, but other queer relationships are still not accepted and stigmatized. For example, polyamorous relationships. There is also a concern that participating in the system reinforces and legitimizes that system. This makes some forms of homosexuality acceptable and pushes other queer identities into less privileged positions. Scholarship, in contrast to liberation movements, encourages instead opting out of systems. There's an idea that in opting in, we are giving into a system that has oppressed us and continues to oppress our community members, especially as queer doesn't get eradicated. The queer as an oppressed, marginalized group doesn't get eradicated, it just gets pushed onto separate identities. Lisa Duggan specifically talks about this form of acceptance really benefiting middle-class white gay men while not benefiting some other members of the community. Intersectionality also becomes a larger focus in scholarship. Chambers-Letson, 2018, specifically centers queers of color in her work, discussing how past theories of social resistance and change did not properly consider marginalized people. Queer liberation cannot liberate queer people if those less privileged are left behind. She also talks about how being marginalized does not imply radical thought and action. This is something that must be chosen. It must be something that happens through education and through pointed action. The title of her first chapter is All of Us or None of Us, a chant I've heard in similar sentiments through my own experiences in the queer community. To summarize, queer theory challenges that which is normalized and the very concept of normalization. The theory is not about garnering acceptance of 2S LGBTQIA people into the systems of power that exist. It is a resistance to the idea of a system that privileges certain kinds of relationships and identities due to their proximity to normal. Most importantly to the theory itself, it is hard to define and is often left undefined on purpose. To people who use queer theory, this is not really seen as a limitation, but to others it definitely is. A clear definition would completely contradict the deconstructive nature of queer theory. Deconstructing the notion that sexuality and gender must be clearly defined also ensures that those who do not fit within specific definitions are not left behind and excluded from queerness. Queer as a political identity becomes clear in its refusal to assimilate, refusal to opt in. There's this understanding in queer theory that assimilation will allow the cycle of oppression to continue with slightly more queer targets instead of as certain queer bodies are normalized. Queer theory works to deconstruct the very system of normal and enforce the acceptance of deviance, of queerness. It doesn't want to normalize queer people, it wants deviance to be something that is accepted. Sorry if I've moved back in the video. The sun is coming at me. No, it's just on my nose. I have this little highlighted nose. So sorry if I ran away. I'm still here. Anyway, I hope this makes sense and I helped create a clearer picture of what queer theory is, even with its refusal of a definition, which makes it kind of hard to describe. This, of course, is not every key queer scholar contributed to queer theory. Key aspect of queer theory. This is a very brief overview. I definitely encourage you to read through some of the sources. I'll include in the description, as well as other sources you can find by looking them up. It's very interesting. That's why I want to do this. It's very cool. Of course, I didn't really talk about the critiques of queer theory, which there is many. Some of them very interesting, very valid, very interesting. Queer theory can sometimes get lost in the discourse and it isn't super helpful for actual queer people experiencing oppression in their lives. If you take anything from this video, know that queer theory, queer activism, and queer identity are different things, but they are intimately related to each other and inform each other. Thanks for listening, maybe engaging, and I hope this was useful or at least interesting. Have a good day and maybe deconstruct something. It could be an abstract idea, culture, or it could be a random object in your room. That would also be fun.